quick introduction for our team. I am Morgan Mays. I serve as the project manager on this project. I am actually sitting in our Coralville project office right now. And then I normally sit in Cedar Rapids or Wilton, Iowa. It just depends. But I've been with HDR for a couple years now, kind of cover a wide gamut of projects myself, from climate studies to flood wall projects to building bridges and roads. So you name it, we take care of it on a lot of different things. So, but with that, I want to give the opportunity for Marcella and then Jeremy to introduce themselves with a quick bio, and then we'll jump into this.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcella Thompson. I am HDR's Director of Sustainability and Resiliency. I sit in Omaha, Nebraska, and have worked in the sustainability field for just about 20 years.
Good afternoon. This is Jeremy Cook. I'm a senior economist out of our Omaha, Nebraska office. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm a senior economist out of our Omaha, Nebraska office. I lead for part of our country the sustainable return on investment modeling that we've used here for City of Iowa City. And I was basically the lead economist in this project.
Thank you, Jeremy. So just real quick, HDR, if you don't know much about us, we are worldwide. We've got over 40 countries and ongoing projects across the world, established back in 1917, 10,000 plus employees, and a couple of those 200 offices are right here in Iowa, so in your back door. You know, so generally speaking, this project and the city itself, I mean, the city has been a leader in environmental stewardship for decades and sustainability for decades. What began as, I would say, a resource conservation and energy efficiency back in the 1980s has really evolved into more of a focused effort to take action on climate change now. So as your climate commission well knows, back in September of 2018, the city council adopted a climate action and adaptation plan and set goals for citywide carbon emission reductions. I believe that goal was originally set at 25 to 28% from 2005 levels, reduce that down by 2025, and then 80%, I believe, by 2050. The bar actually was raised here pretty recently by your commission as well as city council, and increased those by unanimous resolution to increase up to, I believe, 45% now from 2010 levels by 2050, or by 2030 with a net zero by 2050. So, you know, a big push, very proactive approach, I think, by the city. I commend you guys on that. To that purpose, though, enter this project, and I guess as a general statement, general purpose, to evaluate those strategic alternatives that would efficiently capture and beneficially use or reuse methane from both the wastewater plant as well as landfill operations. So continuing to enable the city to take that step forward for implementing their action plans. So as this project then was developed, it really started to focus on two priority action items. Action item 3.7, which was to study to efficiently capture and use methane from the wastewater operations, as well as action 3.8, which is conversely to study the energy generation from the landfill methane, right? So that also tied back into a couple other action items. Action item 3.2, increase the composting of organics. Those organics certainly lead to the generation of methane, as well as action item 1.4 to increase the on-site renewable energy systems and electrification. So this project really ties all those action items together and looks at it as a cohesive picture. You know, really as, I guess, a synergistic approach with respect to the climate action goals. And looking at that. So part of our analysis also included, as Jeremy mentioned, our triple bottom line approach, or SROI, that looked at both the capital, or not both, but all of the capital investment needs, the life cycle greenhouse gas impacts, as well as the energy return on investment. And Jeremy will talk a little bit more on that later. So just a brief history of the project. We started this thing back in about a year from now, really. So last February, we provided a waste shed analysis, really looking at the solids and organics that are currently managed by both facilities, as well as what an incremental increase of waste could do to that biogas production. Then we looked at both facilities as a whole and just looking at what their existing and future conditions of each facility was going to be, and the opportunity for any recovery and reuse of biogas through the study period, which was looking at a 30-year time period. So from 2020 roughly to 2050. Then in May, we provided a biogas utilization technical memo that really evaluated all the different options that we considered for utilizing that biogas. Again, at both facilities, and included a natural gas pipeline injection option, electricity generation, and then also a natural gas replacement. In August, we tied this all back together into what you guys, I believe, received a copy of in your packet of the full financial, or not financial, but feasibility study report. And that evaluated those current and future reuse alternatives and considered the greenhouse gas emission reductions, the energy return on energy invested, and the SROI framework. So briefly, existing conditions at the two facilities. If you're not familiar with this, the wastewater treatment plant itself is the largest user of electricity and natural gas within the city. It processes approximately just under 11 million gallons a day. Methane there is produced predominantly on site during that anaerobic digestion, and then is currently reused on two on-site boilers that heat the biosolids and promote that digestion, and then the remainder is flared off. I believe about 80 CSFM is produced currently at the wastewater treatment plant. At the landfill then, it's a full MSW landfill, serves Johnson County, Kelowna, Riverside, manages approximately 130,000 tons a year of waste. And then food wastes are approximately 25% of that total waste mass, so about 35,000 tons. Methane there is produced during just the waste decomposition process, collected and then flared currently to the atmosphere. Current levels have that around 945 CSM. So really a true order of magnitude difference between the wastewater treatment plant and the landfill. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at alternatives. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Marcella and kind of talk through the process.
Yeah. All right. So as Morgan mentioned in your packet, you saw the feasibility study. Just want to point out that throughout the rest of the presentation, you'll see little footnotes that reference specific sections to that. So as you look at that and cross-reference this presentation, hopefully this orientation will make your review a bit easier. So I'm just going to spend the next few minutes reviewing the alternatives as related to both the facilities, the waste diversion scenarios, and the greenhouse gas emission impacts that we built into the SROI model that Jeremy will talk about. Go ahead, Morgan. So we have, as Morgan explained, there are two facilities that we looked at with regard to biogas generation and beneficial reuse. That is the landfill and co-digestion. Again, just reiterating that the landfill is orders of magnitude more biogas to work with, which certainly factors into the greenhouse gas emission reduction potential. What's interesting about these facilities, and we see this across cities, is that while they in themselves often represent a very small part of the city's greenhouse gas inventory, they themselves are also enablers of change. So in addition to managing emissions at the sites, you can also offset emissions, which is why reuse is such a strong potential. So the first option we looked at, which we will refer to as alternate 1, and 1A is co-digestion and pipeline injection at the wastewater plant, and alt 1B is the same thing, pipeline injection at the landfill. So this is where we would take that biogas, clean it up to pipeline quality, inject that into the pipeline to a standard that can meet the renewable fuel standard, and sell that on the RIN market. So the city would benefit through some direct emission reduction on site. There would not be the same offset within the city boundary as those purchasing the RIN credits would get the reduction out in their realm. The second alternate is electricity generation. This also applies to both the wastewater treatment plant and the landfill. You can advance, Morgan. So this same concept, different scale at both facilities, where we would take that gas, clean it to a quality that it can be used in a generator on site. And then in both cases, we would assume that we've assumed that the quantity of electricity generated is greater than that any of those facilities can consume. So it would involve a partnership with your utilities to put that back onto the grid. We assume that through that agreement, you would be able to retain the renewable energy credits, which would help offset a portion of the city's electricity use with that on-site renewable energy generation. And then the last option we looked at, alternate 3, that is natural gas replacement. That one only applies to the wastewater treatment plant. And so that, again, similar to pipeline injection, where you're cleaning that gas up to essentially equivalent to natural gas, but it would be used on site to displace natural gas that's used. So you realize a cost savings there, as well as a greenhouse gas reduction benefit. Just as a reminder, in all cases, when we're thinking about biogas, it's considered a biogenic carbon source. So when you're composing your city inventory, biogenic carbon is reported separately. So you would realize a reduction related to natural gas or electricity generation. So another important factor, so we just walked through 2 facilities with 3 alternates. The other key factor was, as Morgan mentioned, we understand that a lot of your climate action strategies are interrelated, and certainly in the case of organics management and what the city pursues from incremental diversion will impact those alternates. So we looked at 3 scenarios. One is the business as usual, right? How much organics is being diverted today. We also looked at a scenario which we called the 1,500 tons per year scenario, which represents the incremental capacity of the wastewater treatment plant to co-digest those organics. And then the second one is a low diversion alternative. So that is a 20% incremental capture of organic material, which equates to about 8,500 tons per year. So that would be, in pursuit of that organics recovery climate action strategy. And we looked at these scenarios specifically in those earlier studies in terms of how would that impact the methane generation, both at the wastewater plant and the landfill. And then we ran through the SROI analysis for, again, 2 facilities, 3 alternatives for these 3 different scenarios. So there's lots of iterations that will come to light as Jeremy presents his results. The last thing I wanted to touch on is the greenhouse gas emissions impact that we considered. And you can see here, we've got table 10 within that report. So there's one of those cross references for you. We looked at 3 different greenhouse gas emission impacts. One is the direct emissions. So it takes energy and results in emissions to add additional equipment to scrub the gas, to run the generators, right? So there is some invested carbon in those technologies. So we looked and accounted for any incremental emissions from those processes to beneficially reuse the gas. We also use the EPA WAR model to consider life cycle, cradle to grave impacts. And that really came into place of the alternates where we went from the baseline, business as usual, what you're diverting, to what happens if we pull that out of the landfill and co-digest that, or if we composted that, et cetera. So that accounted for the life cycle emissions from those landfill diversion alternatives. And then the third one is avoided emissions. So particularly in the electricity generation and natural gas displacement, there are avoided emissions from not having to procure that electricity from the grid or buying natural gas and combusting that. And so those were accounted for as well. And so that's one of 2 key inputs into the SROI model. The second one was also the energy return on investment that I'll let Jeremy talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Marcella. So energy return on investment is basically a fairly straightforward calculation. So it's a ratio of the energy output that's gained against the energy input that's required. So think of it as a ratio of how much energy do you get versus the required energy to produce at a set or a given level of energy output. So similar to the greenhouse gas emissions for this analysis, we worked through basically what is the equivalent amount of energy that's delivered, whether it's natural gas or electricity, and then put those all in common units and compare the energy output minus any of the what we call parasitic energy, or the energy used to produce that level of output, and then created a ratio of that against the direct energy input into the calculation. That gave us a life cycle, and we also computed this over the life cycle of the project, so say over a 30-year period, and then computed that ratio. And so similar to the previous slide, what you see here, again, this is table 10 from the report, which shows you the overall score. So the higher the score, the better the EROEI, and we have the ranking of those for all 16 alternatives. Next slide, Morgan. So we've touched a little bit on SROI, or sustainable return on investment, and this is one of the figures that you'll see actually in the biogas utilization report. What SROI is a triple bottom line economic analysis framework, if you will. It came out of the Clinton Global Initiative in 2007. It's something that HDR developed. It, again, is in partnership with the Clinton Global Initiative, is a way of evaluating kind of broader climate and sustainability and resiliency effects of projects beyond just traditional cost-benefit analysis frameworks. And so it relies on a few key principles. One is a triple bottom line accounting of impacts. So economic, environmental, and social are the key bins there, if you will. And we also try and monetize as much of the range of effects as possible. In this case, though, for this project, we focused on electricity generation benefits, greenhouse gas emissions against life cycle costs. But then another aspect of this is we try and incorporate as many of both economic or monetized values as we can, and also key performance indicators. We can't always monetize everything. Even as an economist, I like to try and monetize effects and put them into general comparisons, because that gives us common unit for comparing impacts. But we can't always do that. So we've already talked about the EROEI as well as the greenhouse gas, and those are two key performance indicators that really relate to the effects and goals of the climate action plan here for City of Iowa City. So we basically try and present as much as we can both the performance indicators, kind of non-monetary effects, as well as economic values. So with that, next slide. So this is a summary report, or summary table from table 12, page 28, I believe, of the feasibility report. And what you see here is basically we've taken all of the results from our economic framework, our benefit cost ratios that we computed, the EROEI, sorry, it's a tongue twister every time I say it, as well as the greenhouse gas reductions, and we've converted everything to an index. And then we've taken those indexed values and combined them into basically a composite score that helps us prioritize each of the three alternatives for the different diversion scenarios, if you will, at both the wastewater treatment plant and the landfill location. So to kind of orient you how this table works, if you follow the horizontal axis across the top under where it says do nothing and go across, you'll see for the landfill location, we have no diversion, 1,500 tons per year diversion, and low diversion. And if, sorry, Morgan, if you could go back one figure here. So you'll see, for example, if you just undertake pipeline injection, no diversion at the landfill location, that would be alt 1B. That alternative is given a score of 0.8 versus comparing to the low diversion scenario, alt 1B LB, which has a score of 0.86. So basically what we're saying here with these alternatives is if you walk across that row, the higher the score, the better the alternative, and that's basically gives you a ranking, if you will, of hierarchy in terms of the outcomes. Similarly, if you walk down the vertical axis on the left, we have the same outcomes, basically doing nothing at the landfill, but doing only actions at the wastewater treatment plant. And then following this, we recognize that there's potential for combinability, if you will, of these actions. So let's say you could do something at the landfill location, maybe some electricity generation, and then what could you do, something at the wastewater treatment plant, then following that same organization of alternatives. And so that, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so this shows like where you kind of need to follow the alternatives here, because it's important to note that you've got to stay within diversion scenarios when you're comparing actions and trying to determine what is kind of the best strategy forward. So with that in mind, you've got to follow the new diversion, the 1,500 ton per year diversion, and the low diversion scenarios as you're kind of walking through and trying to pair these up. So again, if we just think about like, if the city stays at no diversion, doesn't increase any incremental diversion over where it's at, then what we're showing here is that your best return is actually doing your first at the landfill location, doing pipeline injection, your alt 1B, no diversion with a score of 0.8. And then that could be combined with pipeline injection at the wastewater treatment plant location for a combined score of 1.02. And if you walk back through the individual results for EROI, benefit cost ratio, and the greenhouse gas emissions, you can kind of see how those scores combine and get to the 0.8 and the 0.23. And then similarly, as we go up to the 1,500 tons per year diversion on the next slide, we have a similar construction here, but this time you can see that our highest score, because we're getting some value back in terms of electricity generation, you stay with your the pipeline injection at the landfill, but then you add to that electricity generation at the wastewater treatment plant. And then that also holds true then when you get to the low diversion scenario. If you were to increase up to 8,500 tons per year in terms of diversion, you would see again, you'd have a score of 1.37 for your basically your highest ranked alternative, which again includes pipeline injection and electricity generation. So again, this is summarized. There's an explanation of how all this works in the feasibility study. That section of the report kind of lays out, basically how you need to follow the logic for this table and basically combine alternatives. So with that in mind, we can see where the highest ranked alternatives are. And then the next question that came out of this was, well, what are the financial implications of this? Is this financially actionable? So we added to a supplemental analysis to this with Joe's request, Joe and the city's request to basically do like a financial payback period to see how this would all pencil out. So on the next slide, or the next two slides, we have a quick summary of the financial analysis. So again, pipeline injection is really the, at the landfill is kind of the best alternative in terms of if you're just going to do one alternative initially. From a financial viability standpoint, it is actually the only alternative that generates a payback on its own within the 30-year period. And actually all of these alternatives can break even with a bond term of at least 18 years, which is a fairly robust result considering a lot of sometimes even bond terms go as far as 20 to 25 years. For all of these alternatives, operating costs do exceed the financial benefits. So that is kind of the thing that's really holding this back here in terms of the other alternatives. On the next slide, we did identify that there is potential that if on the electricity side, if you could get like a $20 million in grant funding, or if you were to negotiate an electricity sales buyback, then there would be potential for electricity generation at the landfill could break even within a 30-year period as well. But again, you need basically a grant or investment to help, basically make that happen.
I guess just in general summary here and potential next steps, I understand you guys all received a copy of the report, so I believe our whole team is going to be available at the next meeting to field any other, kind of more in-depth questions that you guys may have, give you guys the opportunity to go through that report in a little bit more detail. So, in general summary though, this looked at 18 unique possible combinations, in addition to just those 3 kind of lanes or scenarios at each facility that you could look at. I do want to point out that when we look at low diversion, that low diversion is at 8,500 tons a year. That actually exceeds the capacity that your existing wastewater treatment plant can take. So that does require a separate co-digestion facility or an expansion of the existing digester facility. So that is part of why those costs, if you look through the report, are so high on those items. So just an important note that, and why you have this matrix, that everything kind of aligns with that. If you have a low diversion scenario, that means you are looking at both facilities treating that there. But really we're aligning those organics recovery, right? So I think the first step, and we offer a path forward suggestion in the report, and the first one on that is really for the city and the Climate Commission to come to terms on what targeted diversion scenario makes the most sense for you. We've listed a couple different alternatives and options, and we really want to be able to kind of narrow down the list, right? So if we can narrow that list down, then we can look at what the next steps would be on that. We can dig further into the cost estimation. It's important to remember this is a study level. Those cost estimates that are put together have a fair amount of contingency in there to cover some of the unknowns that are certainly numerous at this point in stage in the process. So further evaluate what that full life cycle cost of a cogen facility, if it's desired, is going to be, or what that biogas utilization option is best for either electricity generation or the natural gas pipeline injection. We'd also then, once we have more of a clear path forward, we can start to connect the dots between other projects. There are projects at the wastewater treatment plant that look at rehab to the digester. So maybe there's a chance to align projects, find some efficiencies and costs, things of that nature. Similar to how we looked at the different action plans and the connections between each of them, there are certainly options to minimize that capital increase, that capital cost at the beginning, and align it a little bit with the other projects. Ultimately though, until we get some of those clear path forwards designed, we can't move forward into bringing a project from idea to reality. So there's path forward that's listed in both the executive summary of the report as well as at the end of the report. I think they offer at least an idea of what needs to take place for the city and the commission to be engaged, as well as the community level. Maybe there's public-private partnerships that certainly come into play here to figure out a way to bring some of these action items to reality. The next step beyond that would be more of a conceptual and more detailed design process. So with that, we would certainly welcome any other questions that you guys have. And again, our whole team will be available during the next commission meeting to field more detailed questions. Joe or Ashley can certainly send out our emails if anyone wants to pass along questions to them, that we can start fielding those ahead of time. So other than that, thank you very much for the opportunity. This has been a fun project for us, and I think the city has certainly really been engaged with it, which made for the project that it became.